Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm going to give a few minutes for people to join us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we've got some people filtering in. Good afternoon. So as we have people join, if you could, you've got a couple of tools in Zoom at your disposal to communicate with us. You have the chat panel, and then you also have a questions panel. If you could, just send to the chat panel, let us know where you're joining from so we can see where folks are located. We've got Puerto Rico, Denver, Virginia. We're in Virginia. I'm in Virginia. Illinois, New York, Utah, Chicago, North Carolina, where Yoma is, Tennessee, California, New Jersey, Chicago, Washington. Let's see, Tulsa, Boston, Seattle, Minneapolis, New York, Tucson, Kansas City, Brooklyn, Kinder Academy from Philly, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, California, Richmond. Wow, lots of people. Oregon, great. Los Angeles, where Tatiana is. She's got some neighbors here. Okay, so we still got looks like a few people joining. We're gonna get started in just a minute. We're just gonna give people a chance to log into the webinar, but I really appreciate you being here. And if you could, just let us know in the chat panel where you're from. San Diego, Louisiana, Utah, Maine. I'm always like so amazed when we start these webinars, people from all across the country, all across the world. It's incredible. I'm so glad you all could join us today. All right, terrific. It looks like I think the majority of folks who are going to be here today have joined. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Know, Then Grow, Becoming an Anti-Racist, Anti-Biased, Trauma-Informed Educator. We are super, super excited to have Dr. Yoma Iruka here with us today. We're going to have I think, really engaging discussion with her. We will be trying to save some time and answer some questions from you all in the webinar towards the end. So use that Q&A panel to submit questions to Yoma. I'll filter those through and we'll try and tackle some of those along the way. If you have any technical issues, send them in the chat. We'll monitor the chat. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So I just want to say welcome. My name is Winston. I am the Senior Director of Marketing for Teachstone. We are super excited to be presenting this webinar today. I want to cover a few housekeeping notes. So I mentioned the chat panel and the questions panel, how you can use those. We'll also be conducting a few polls throughout the webinar, so those will pop up on your screen. We'll give 30 seconds to a minute for you to answer those, and we'd appreciate the feedback. It helps us kind of understand who's here, and also just get a sense for how you're doing. So we'll go through some interactive polls. We want to make sure this session is engaging as we can make it. I've already gotten a couple of questions. Will we get a certificate of attendance for this webinar? Yes, you will. That will come tomorrow via email. So you'll get an email with a link to not just the certificate, but to any of the resources that that we share out in today's webinar. We'll send you links to those resources and more information on some additional resources and learnings so that you can learn more about the subject matter. Let's see, what else? Other housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded. We'll send out the recording tomorrow as well. And we will also send out the slides from the presentation. So feel free to share those after the fact with anyone else that you think would benefit. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few minutes here giving some background about Teachstone and who we are and what we do. So Teachstone is an educational company located in Charlottesville, Virginia. We focus on ensuring that all students have access to life-changing teachers, and we work with organizations around the country and around the world, and we're mostly known as the publishers of class. And so I want to run a quick poll here just so we can get a sense of how familiar you are with class. So if you could spend a couple of seconds and let us know how familiar you are with class and how you use class, just to help us understand who's here and how familiar you are with the class system. Okay, so we got about 50% of the votes in. We're gonna give this another 5 or 10 seconds and then we'll close out the poll. Okay, so results are in. Good mix of folks. About half are using class for assessment and professional development. Some using class just to collect assessment data. 23 people don't know a whole lot about class. That's fine. I'll give you just a brief overview of what class is, but class knowledge for this webinar session is not super important, and these concepts will be applicable to anyone in attendance, so don't worry. But what is class? So class stands for the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, and it's a system for measuring and improving teaching quality, and it specifically looks at the interactions between teachers and children. And then taking the measurement of those interactions, you align that to professional development to help educators learn and improve. So quick check-in. We've already gone through this. I'll skip this, but where you're from. And I'm going to launch one more poll just to get a feel of how are you doing today. On a scale of 1 to 5, not so good being a 1, and 5 being fantastic, doing great. It's interesting to see these results come in. I'll share them out in a second. I think what's encouraging is we've run webinars over the past several months, and I think there's been a general shift towards the higher ranges of these values. So that's a good thing. Okay, so we've got most of the votes in. I'll share the results. Most people are doing pretty good. So people are about a 4, some at 3s, a few people at 1s and 2s. So stick with us. Hopefully this session lifts you up a bit. Hopefully you learn from it, and hopefully it's a positive spot in your day. Okay, so if you could, in the chat panel there, let us know, what are you most concerned about as children come back to school? And I'll read some of these out from the chat panel. We can see chats coming in. Germs, safety, health and safety, trauma, social emotional development, mental health, health and safety, separation anxiety, stress levels, lots of concerns around safety. I think that's top of mind for everyone today. Social emotional support, mental health, relationships, trauma. Been hearing a lot, folks concerned about the emotional well-being of children and the trauma that they've experienced. We're going to talk about a little bit of that today. Mental health. I think everybody's struggling a bit with mental health given the current climate. Stressed out kids. Okay, keeping social distance. Yep. how to keep them safe. Regression in students. They've been out of the classrooms for a while. Okay, thank you everyone for those submissions. It's helpful to hear. Access to support for sure. There's a big role to play now in supporting children as they come back. Okay, one last poll here, and then we'll get into the discussion with Ioma. But just so we have an idea of who is in attendance, if you could let us know what your role is in your organization. We'll give this just another few seconds. Okay, so we've got a variety of folks here in attendance. 22% coaches or mentors, some observers here, administrators, about 12% of the audience administrators, good number of teachers, and we're so glad that you're here. And then some folks doing some other things. And regardless of your role, we're happy that you're here, and we hope that you will find value in the conversation. I think you will. I think that we'll discuss concepts that could be used across any of these roles, and I think that the topic is certainly relevant for anyone in any of these positions. Okay, great. Oh, and I've got a bit of a slowdown here on the slide loading. We'll give this just a second. Tell you what, we'll just switch to this view for the moment, and then I'll go back to the full view. We're having troubles with loading this slide for some reason. Okay, so as I said, thank you for being here. And I want to give a second for Dr. Ioma Iruka and for Tatiana to give introductions, a little bit of background on who they are and what they do.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm so thrilled that you all are here and just to hear all your chats. So as you know, I am the Chief Research Innovation Officer, and I direct the research unit at HighScope Education Research Foundation. And we know HighScope is best known for the preschool study and really helped to establish the evidence around the importance of the early years for children's school success, but also just lifelong and health outcomes. And I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'll say more. I just say I'm a social justice researcher in many ways, because in the end of it, research is only useful if it can actually ensure that children and families and educators have the best of what they need to do the best and be the best. So I just look forward to the conversation and just glad that y'all are here, even during these most challenging times. And thank you, Winston, and all of Keystone for having me be part of this.
I'm honored to be sharing this slide with you. And my name is Tatiana Logan. I work at Teachstone as an instructional design manager. And I have a personal mission that's highly invested in today's topics, trying to create a world in which, and a nation in which every child has a life of real choices. We know that there are many inequities in our history and our current educational system in which not every child does have a life of real choices about where they can get an education and what the education looks like and their life beyond. So that anti-bias, anti-racist work is really important for me, and I just feel honored to be able to be here to learn alongside all of you from across the country. I'm also here in LA, so hello, good morning to my West Coast folks, and good afternoon to my East Coast folks. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Oops, sorry for that. And I'm going to hand over to Tatiana to kind of lead the discussion with Ioma. But there were a few different topic areas that we're going to talk about today. The reality of racism and implicit bias in learning settings and the link to trauma. White privilege, institutional racism, and the need for system and in-classroom change. And then preparing for discussions of race and anti-racism with children and families this fall. There's just been so much that's happened in the world. I think that this is an incredibly important time for us to be having this discussion. And with that, I'll hand over to Tatiana and Ioma.
Great, thank you, Winston. I'm really feeling everyone's anxieties with those responses about opening this fall. And we know we've had some recent reports come out about safety and social emotional well-being for reopening this fall, and when students are coming back to their schools, childcare centers, Head Starts. Yoma, talk us through that from an equity lens. What are you thinking and feeling about this fall, and how we can best support all of our students in an equitable way?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that's a great topic, a timely question, et cetera. And I'll first say this, that we know a lot of our early education, many of them from the community-based organization standpoint, stayed open, right? They were essential settings that had to remain open. So for a lot of them, they've been dealing with, what do you do when kids come back? And there's been some, fallout because a lot of the, providers got sick or children got sick. So I think it's a really important discussion. And I should make note, for those who may not know, the National Academies just released a report just this morning at 11 o'clock to provide some guidance about how to reopen. And they really place it within an equity perspective. And so when we think about reopening, how do you deal with social distancing with young children? How do you just deal with the issue of that for many providers who that is your livelihood, right? Many early child programs are already on a shoestring budget. So when you're not being forced to open with fewer kids, and then it's also, we've learned from those that have remained open, the inconsistent children who are there, because obviously issues of either fearing getting sick or actually getting sick, and et cetera. So there's a host of decisions that need to be made. Who gets to be priority to return, right? Who gets priority in terms of who gets virtual learning? Like, there's a lot of equity questions that need to be framed. So I think I would encourage people to really think about who needs to be in care and need to experience that, and who can't. And if they can't, what could we do to support children, to support families, but also support providers, right, and our educators. I just found the responses interesting when you ask, what are you feeling today, or the fears about, opening up? And then maybe we'll talk about children and families, like sort of health and safety. And only a few people, I think, when I saw the list, actually said fear for themselves, right? So this is where early child always is, especially in programs where a lot of, in community-based programs, a lot of the providers and educators are people of color and women who are both the caregivers and educators of young children, but also at home. And so being able to really understand that there's a lot being put on the early education system and the workforce. And we have to think about, what are we doing to compensate them for what they're doing, but to also provide the support and emotional support that they need, because in many ways, they're experiencing a lot of trauma, and they're going to get even more trauma, whether vicariously or directly, because of the children that they likely serve and the families that they're likely supporting. So to me, the issues of reopening equity need to sort of happen in a way that really says, we can't go back to pre-COVID. Like, all this idea, I think the issue I'm having is people are like, oh, I want to go back to normal. For some of us, normal was not a good thing. Like, and so the question is, how do we return to schools, early education programming in a way that really can meet the best needs of children and families and the workforce, that is equitable, and that really says, we're not going to be perfect during this pandemic, but we can sure do better than we did pre-COVID-19.
Yes. And I'm hearing you talk about this really important intersection between our health and safety and racism in America, and the fact that we have a pandemic going on with COVID-19 and the realities of people of color, and specifically Black and brown children in America, and what our education system has done historically to support students, and where we're missing the mark already before COVID, and adding on that layer now. So let's maybe talk a little bit about the definition of, where do you see this intersection between trauma and the conversation around trauma in classrooms right now, and anti-racist, anti-bias work? How do you see those two things intersecting?
So thank you. So I feel like, Tatiana, part of the challenge so before COVID, there was already this discussion about trauma-informed care, and it always hinged on sort of ACEs, right? Diverse childhood experiences, right? Like, which are children who are neglected, abused, who may have a parent with depressive symptomology, or who may have parents who have some, mental health challenges. And there was really a discussion or conversation around the impact of racism, right? That was the part that to me was really like that boiled me a bit. And actually say it boiled me to the point of that, I wrote a book with colleagues about how do you, don't look away. How do you create an anti-racist early education classroom? Because it felt like people just want to sort of ignore this big elephant in the room, that racism has been part of everything that America did and does, right? From putting segregation, that from Jim Crow to basically not providing people with a sense of humanity, from witnessing Black people being killed to children being held hostage, right? So there's so much trauma just on the racism end of things that were rarely ever talked about on a national level. And so to sort of in many ways, it was this idea of color blindness that was guiding the country, and many segments of early childhood included, right? Where it was like, we don't see people's color, which in many ways is actually in its own way traumatic, because that means that you're not seeing my pain, you're not seeing children's pain and agony, you're not seeing children who have witnessed their parents, their loved ones, or those who look like them get murdered, right? So there's so many things that were happening from, Michigan, where high school is located, children, lead poisoning, like, right, which has a lot of generational impact, right? So this is not like where, racism started yesterday. And the fact that we never really understood or talked about how it impacts families' well-being, family stability, family stressors, and the issues of microaggressions and microinvalidations, right? Like where people didn't understand how taxing is it for a child to come into a classroom and know that I am not viewed as the rest of my peers because of the color of my skin, or only because of the way I sound. And so the fact that we never talked about it was traumatizing, because you never validated how critically important that was to children. And so the idea of now trauma-informed care to just focus on certain things and not racism was a problem. And I think now, I think COVID-19 helped to really peel that off, right? It helped to peel that there's a reason why Black and brown people are likely to get sick, but also likely to die from it. Because it sort of showed that racism is real and it actually kills you, right? So if you're in early childhood, it kills your spirits, right? And when you're being suspended or expelled, or not provided with an environment that's nurturing, that's affirmative, right? We knew what it was doing to a lot of our Black and brown children. And so now I think it's an opportunity for us to say, you know what, could we do and be better? Especially when we know that it exists and is real and it was killing a lot of communities. And even, we had all the data about implicit bias. I mean, I remember years ago, I'm a parent of a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. The fear was my kid was going to be, my 7-year-old who's 7 now was going to be suspended. So we had to pick specifically who is going to be the educator for my child, because she's vocal, she knows what she means, she means what she says. But that could be viewed as oppositional, right? And so there's a lot of things that we already knew, and then the data confirmed. And now we're all aware about implicit bias, which really is an example of racism, right? It's an example of really how children who have helped to build the system of early childhood. Remember, early childhood started with primarily Black children who were poor. And the fact that they still are not provided with the best of the best, and the fact that they're usually excluded in everything from the standards to even the workforce level, and then also thrown out at the highest level, is a form of racism starting early. And then of course it manifests over time. So this is where we have to begin to say, early childhood, we have to be part of the solution of racism and not continue to be racist in the way that we both do our classroom instruction, but also how we live in everyday society.
I'm loving this. Thank you. I mean, this is so important. And as you mentioned, trauma is generational, and it's a matter of life and death. It really is, every single day. And so to connect that with our early learning settings, as you mentioned, there's been, wider visibility into implicit bias and racism, especially since the deaths of George Floyd and murdering of Breonna Taylor, and so many others across our nation daily. But I'm seeing in some of our comments, some folks are a little bit earlier in the journey and trying to figure out, what are we even talking about when we are talking about implicit bias, and specifically in the early learning setting? So you mentioned a few examples, speaking about your son. What are some other examples of implicit bias that we find in early learning settings? So then let's talk about that so we can get to that juicy question you just said of how do we become part of the solution, right? So before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about some of the problems that we see in early learning settings today.
Sure, I think exactly. Let's get it right down to like those who are in the room. So I'll just make it clear. I'll push it out, make it clear in terms of the suspension expulsion. So that's the one example often given. So in essence, Black children, Black boys, and even Black girls are more likely to be suspended than any other group of kids in early childhood and in pre-K specific. So basically, Black children make up about 19 to 20% of the program, and almost 50% of expulsion suspensions, right? So that means that they are disproportionately basically thrown out. And we're talking about, again, 36-month-olds and 48-month-olds being thrown out. And we have even data from other places where infants and toddlers are also disproportionately thrown out of programs. Again, let's remember infants, 12 months old and 24-month-old, that range. And so that's one of the big examples given. Another example that we've seen from, like, example, Walter Gilliam's work, where in essence, he basically showed a video to teachers and said, hey, and it was a white girl, a white boy, a Black girl, a Black boy. And he says, just let me know when you see whether any of the sort of bad behaviors that are happening. And so teachers, we come to find, were usually looking at the Black children and oftentimes saw bad behaviors in the Black children, especially the Black boys. But come to find out, there were no bad behaviors at all to be witnessed. It's basically children playing. And so that again proved that there was this sort of sense of almost anticipation that children, sorry, the video came out, sorry, that the Black children in particular were always going to be oppositional and defiant. Some other examples beyond just the behavior is also just the ways of talking, right? A lot of Black children, other children of color, have a different way of sort of communicating, right? So like, for example, they may use sort of different dialects, and oftentimes that's viewed as not being smart, right? There's only one way to speak, school language. And so children who speak a different kind of English are viewed as less than smart, or not viewed as really intellectually gifted. We also see in terms of the kind of equality, right? We always assume that every single child is in high quality programs. That is not the case. A lot of Black children are often in segregated, low resource programs as well. Again, these are examples of those sort of things. Another example is the images we show in the classrooms, right? Do we often just show, the Latino people are sort of workers in the field, or the Black people are often sort of just the bus drivers? So there are many examples, even real life, that we show to children about, you can never be the leader. You can never be the educator. You could be an assistant and an aide and a staff and a cook, but you cannot be the educator who stands in front of the room. Other examples are the kind of books that we're reading that may never actually show a Black or brown child, that they may never ever show the fact that, the Black children, brown children experience the same kind of sort of life experiences, like going to the park and going to the zoo. So even looking at some of our literature that we expose children to, don't actually show the phenotype of Black people. Our play areas, do they have anything to sort of do with the artifacts and the cultures of different children, or is it pretty much the standard sort of thing? So there's many examples, both in the environments, also in the interactions that we're having. So I think there's many examples, and I would suggest, obviously, and we talk a lot about this in our books, about there's some specific things just structurally in early childhood that sort of, I would push to say they're really racist, right? Because only certain people get to be certain leaders. And then also in the environments that we're creating, and also in the kind of language that we're using as well.
There's so much there that I can't wait to unpack in terms of the action and the environment and things that we can do. You're also talking about historical history of power and privilege in our educational systems, and specifically naming white privilege, right? So those numbers, it's striking when you see them on graphs, but also if you think about every single number is a little child, as you name, right? An infant, a toddler in a classroom who has already been in a society that is racialized. That's the reality of America. And then our environments and schools are as well. So before we get into some of the kind of external work we can do in talking with our children, we dive a little bit into us, right? Like, I'm a white woman in America in education. What can I do to analyze my own privilege as it shows up in my life, but especially in my classroom, to help move this work forward and actually become an anti-racist educator? Before we get into like the actions, right, with interacting with my students, what can I do as a white woman, especially in education? And we know how that our structures have been really built for me, so I may not know the other ways that children are learning in their environments.
Yes. Well, I feel like, thank you. I think it's important, which is don't go do something. Like, I think there's always this need to, like, the savior, like, don't go be a savior, right? I think your question exactly is, what do I need to do? The self-reflection, the self-interrogation. Now, even if you say, I got Black and brown friends and my best friends, so so to me, part of that is really the self-inquiry. Like, first, I talk about, like, why are you in this institution? Like, this early education is an institution. Why are you here? Was it through the sort of savior complex? Was it because you really are like, this is the first and the formative years of children's development? I want to be part of that and shape them and support their families. Like, I think it's to really understand why you are here. And if really part of the reason that you are in this institution is because you're like, oh no, all those Black and brown children, especially, and those poor children just need my brilliance, especially white women, then you may need to actually really dig really deep as to why. Do you think that you can fix the children? Or do you really feel like, I could really learn from the children and their families and communities, and also share the wealth that I also can bring, right? So that back and forth. So I think part of it is really to interrogate completely who you are, what your purpose is. And then I think it's just be honest, right? How much do you really, really, really see the experiences and the color? Like, to me, I want people to see, like, I'm a Black person. I am brown, right? And so I think it's important for people to see me. Like, if you see me and you hear me, then that is a beginning step. So I think it's to also interrogate, what are the sort of uncomfortable underlying biases you may have, right? Do you sort of, clutch your purse, or do you clutch yourself when you walk into a classroom? Is there a certain kid that you're like, I don't want to see their mom and dad, and you don't know why? Is there a certain group of kids that you're like, I hope they're not here today, right? Or, that you kind of maybe are happy when they're not there, right? And so I think part of it is to really, really go and really look at, just interrogate, look at even you go to your classroom, right? Step back and go to your classroom and say, where am I privileging only the whiteness and the white people, right? Where am I only thinking about my, from my lens, especially if it's a white person? And I would even argue for people who are Black and also brown, we are not immune from privilege and whiteness. That is, we all drink the same water. We all drink the same Kool-Aid. We see anything particularly that is Black as negative. This has been shown over time. And so part of it is for us to really dig deep into, say, why do I have these feelings? But also realize that we are drinking the water that basically says anything Black is probably pretty bad. Anything brown, anything that's immigrant, anything that doesn't sound like me is probably pretty bad. That's just the nature of it. And so part of that is also to not just follow your emotions, but to also do a lot of reading. Whether, the beauty of 2020 is you can read, you can watch a movie, you can listen. There's so many, you could go sit down and watch a bunch of Facebook. So to me, there's so many, like, the idea of I don't have time to read is like, trust me, there's so many options that I think part of it is you also want to become better educated. And so that's why I say, as much as I want you to self-interrogate, we also have to, I would say, correct our miseducation. The US has systematically miseducated a lot of us, right? We have not learned the full facts about history. So of course I say, go read all the stuff from Nicole Hannah-Jones from the 1619 Project, go to African American History Museum, go look at all the museums around the indigenous populations, Mexico, Chicano, and even the Japanese internment camp. Like, we need to our history about how the US in itself has oppressed people, and that's really white people, has oppressed a lot of people of color. And when you have that lens, then I think it really helps to take away some of the emotional part and just says, you know what, I can do better, right? And so this is where, to me, part of the self-reflection is also realizing that all of us have been miseducated, and how do we go towards educating ourselves before we go save everybody, because you cannot save me if you cannot save yourself. So I will encourage the self-interrogation to happen along with the education. And again, I don't mean go get a PhD, which you can if you want to. Feel free to call me and I can talk to you about it. But it's to really educate all of us about the system of the US, because if you don't know it, you don't see it. And if you don't see the damage and the trauma and how racism literally is filtered through every single thing that we do, and racism includes white privilege. And so that becomes hard. I just want to give one example. I was on a call the other day, and I love it. One of my woke white colleagues said in the call that, you know what, I know now that, you know, we need to talk about race and racism and white privilege. And, you know, and what I've also learned is that, you know, once we take into account, you know, our race, that poverty is really the rationale, is really the reason we're all here, is because of poverty. No, that is factually not true. So if you leave in this webinar, if nothing else, is to say part of what has happened is people assume that it's all because you are poor. Yes, there can be many people, maybe Black people and Latino people who are poor, but there's many of us who are not poor, and we're likely to die in childbirth, likely to still live in segregated, low resource communities, likely to get shot and killed. So poverty is not an inoculator of racism in many ways, right? Does it help to be a little rich? Yes, but it's not going, you can't wear your money on your forehead and says, please don't kill me because I'm rich. That is not, we have seen many examples of where people who grew up in higher income households, especially Black people, are actually likely to also be poor and be imprisoned. So I think we need to be very cautious that we don't use the reasons of you're poor, because people who are dying from COVID-19, all of them were not poor. A lot of them were well-educated people who died because of racism, because racism actually does kill you.
Yes. And we're getting a lot of comments of folks really feeling represented in what we're talking about. And I think that really shows that there is movement towards us talking about cultural competence, unconscious bias, implicit bias, but there's so much more work for us to do here. And when I say us, I mean all of us, right? In different capacities within our identity caucuses, within cross-racial groups, within intersectional identities. We know that race is just one of our identities, but as you stated, we also have data and real life experience that shows us that race has absolutely undeniable impact on every single person's life in America. So as I'm looking at a time, like there's so much more we could talk about, but as we get into it and thinking about the equitable classroom, you've mentioned a few things that we can do. You've mentioned, you know, obviously our internal learning at this point, right? I mean, talk about books, Facebook, I mean, even Instagram, right? Our stories, TikTok, you can learn a lot in 1 minute, right? There's so many ways for us to be learning and exposing ourselves to other viewpoints, and unlearning is really important, as you mentioned, right? How can we unlearn the miseducation that we've been taught? Now let's talk about our children. So if we're doing works as adults towards being anti-racist and anti-bias, how can we ensure that our classrooms, our early learning settings are also promoting that kind of learning with our children and the environment that has that representation? Some folks are talking specifically during COVID about the xenophobia that we see in America, right? Our Asian American communities and children and teachers are all really being highlighted. I mean, there's so much going on right now, right? And each region of the US kind of has their own story, but we're all connected through it. So what does that look like, a role of an educator? We have coaches on the call, we have observers, to be thinking about equitable classrooms in their locus of control.
Yep. So I just want to make a couple of comments to some of the things you said. So I would say it's probably going to be hard for anybody to be culturally competent, right? Even within, you know, the Latino group, you can't be competent in anyone. They can't be competent. We can't be competent, just like as a Black person. I mean, from the diaspora, there's a lot of people who can be competent. I would say first, really, you can be anti-racist or racist. That's probably that to me is the best way. And what does that mean for the classroom? That means that we have to actually interrogate what are the standards we have, for example, like what are the standards we have in terms of what makes a good quality classroom, and whose lens is that? So for example, you know, I'm going to, you know, put Keystone in class, you know, as, you know, part of the thinking, right? So for class, you know, there's one of the domains is around emotional support, right? And within there are all these dimensions, right? And one of the ones that always gets me is the negative regard. And I want y'all to go to the analyses. A lot of times you're like, it's the Black teachers that get dinged. It's being viewed as negative, right? And a lot of times because they're being viewed by usually a white person who's saying, you are being too harsh. And the reality is, from your perspective probably, but from the child's lived experiences, that's not harshness, actually. That's just me being firm, right? Because the idea is that if I'm not firm enough with you, when you go out in society, you may get killed. Right? This is where we have actually had children been arrested, and we've had children actually been killed because people felt like they weren't obeying quote unquote authority, right? So this is part of the how in many ways history works, also how trauma works, like, right? Because a lot of also our teachers of color are experiencing the similar kind of trauma as our children and our families. So that's sort of one example of sort of like, we can't be culturally competent. We could be definitely anti-racist. And so how are some ways we can do that? So I would say, obviously, we're all, and I would say, like, I'm on a journey. I'm still on a journey. Like, there's things I'm learning, things I'm learning more of, right? So like, there's room to grow. And even if you're in the beginning, like you just discovered yesterday that was racism, because you thought once Obama was elected, we were all free and ready to go. No, right? So many of us thought we were over, and most of us black people, no, this is just the beginning. So if you're in the beginning part of it, right, and where, if you're the kind of, you've been in the journey and you've been fighting the fight, regardless of where that is, I think as you go through that, the point is now, what do you do in the classroom? To me, part of that is, one, you really, really engage with your colleagues, and engage, if you're a coach, you're engaging with your mentees, you're engaging with your organization, because you can't try to go fix a teacher if you yourself are racist, because all those things come out in many, many ways. So that's one example. So I think that's one. I think is really making sure that we have the same definition of what is racist and what is anti-racist. So I would say that's one. Two is looking at your environment, right? Are you having artifacts? I already said the standards. What are the curriculum? Does the curricula actually have encourage you to sort of engage with different families, to talk about real life things that are happening in the community, right? If your community, for example, if you're in Chicago, in certain places at certain times, we actually know teachers and children who've been shot. And so by you just saying, oh, that didn't happen, doesn't make sense. So how much does your curriculum actually embrace some of the really hard things, but also just the lived experiences of people? That's two. Three is, how are we connecting with families? So to me, part of being anti-racist is actually saying, how do I connect with my families? And if nothing else, I hope COVID-19 has helped to sort of, in some ways, show that many families of color are really engaged in your child's life, right? So like, you can't talk to a child, you can't meet with a child, you can't get on anybody's Zoom or Google Hangout if a parent is not, or some adult is not there. So hopefully there's at least you're taking into account the parents have always been engaged and always been there, particularly families of color, but that their lives are so hectic, right? They were always having losses. There was always trauma being visited upon them. So hopefully there's much more engagement about how do we become family centered, right? How do we really say, hey, family, I am here for you. What are you doing well? What are your goals? What are your beliefs? What are your experiences? And how can I make sure that what I'm providing to you and your family, especially your children, is really what you want and what you think is really valuable? Like, we need to begin to sort of like dial back, like, oh, I need to give you the ABCs and all of these things, without actually saying, what do you expect? Like, what is your value system? So I think a lot of times we just think, we tell families, here's what you need, right? And we actually never ask, what do you actually really need? And same thing with programs, like, how do we find out, is this good enough for you, right? Does me open and help you in any way? What should it look like? Are we asking families the question of reopening, right? Even that kind of thing. So there's a whole environmental thing to do. And then I would say the other part is about the relationship you have with your children. So for me, I don't want you talking to any of my kids if you've never, ever, 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 ever thought about the fact that they were Black, or they were brown, or that they were Asian, or they were immigrants, or they didn't speak English. I don't want you to touch it with a 200-foot pole. I want you to at least first, bottom line, and I think class is a great tool to really measure, how nurturing and affirming are you with not just the 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 children who are vocal or like you or like your kids. What about the kids who are not like you, who don't sound like you, who don't look like you, who don't eat the same food as you, and who have totally different celebrations as you? So do you have a relationship with that child? And do you have a relationship with that family? And so to me, before you can start any conversations around issues of anti-racism or racism, is that you want to know who your kids are. You also want to observe. So the other part I would say is for you to be an anti-racist, to observe. Are there certain languages that your children are using in terms of power and control, right? So part of sort of early childhood is that we privilege those who have language. We privilege those, a language that we think is better, right? So those who speak English in the standard American way are privileged. So let's be clear about that part, right? So if we privilege those language, one, and then do we privilege those who are like us and like our kids? Do we witness our children playing only with certain groups of kids who are maybe from their community, right? And do we even do any of that observation? So I say you have to observe your children and see whether only certain groups of children get to be the doctor, or get to be the teacher versus you're the maid, the cook, the assistant, right? So again, I think part of it is you don't have to do something, but what you can do is to really observe the interactions happening, which we see a lot in the playground and we see a lot during dramatic play. And so a lot of that is to observe children in those interactive spaces. And this may be the opportunity time to intervene, and not intervene sort of like, hey, don't do that, because kids, they note. If you say, don't do that, and you don't even give any context and you don't actually go into detail, that's the problem. When kids notice adults are shy about something, like, oh, don't say that, don't do that, that means that they know this is really the territory I shouldn't be part of. So part of it is to become comfortable talking about issues of race, but really about fairness, right? Children, if nothing else, children know about fairness. So to me, the best avenue is when there's opportunity to talk about fairness and asking the question, so why did you say that Johnny can't come to your party because, you don't know if you like his brown skin? Or why do you think that you should be the doctor and so should be the patient, right? When you begin to see those power dynamics, because again, children mimic adults. And they absorb everything, whether you say it or not. Children see everything and they hear everything and they see a pattern of who's getting kicked out, who's being called on to say, hey, sit down, go shut up. But all these things, they actually get a sense of who is not liked. And they actually start mimicking that. So this is where I think observing children and also observing what are they doing and whether they reflect a little bit of either who you are and what they're seeing, or maybe who, other adults in the classroom. So to me, there are many examples you can begin to I think you don't have to go full Blazer or Racial Equity Institute in your classroom, but you can actually begin to observe interactions, observe the environment, and maybe actually ask families, right? Like families, especially families of color who are sensitive to both their Blackness and brownness and the other, versus like I'm sensitive to, I know what white people like and I know what I prefer, right? So I'm aware of that. And so when schools ask me, I'm like, here's what I think, right? So there are many families who are willing, if they're given the opportunity. So I would say, ask them, are there ways that I can incorporate your life into, whether it's the environment, whether it's in the curriculum, whether it's in the interactions. Again, there's many ways that I think we can begin to bring the voices of families there, but also community, right? We're a part of a community. And to me, early child shouldn't say, oh, well, here, bring all your kids, community and family, and I'll fix them and send them back to you. I think what we need to really do is really think through whether we're engaging in anti-racist or racist behavior. If you literally are not bringing your community into your world, I would say that's probably a little bit racist. No, that's a lot, because your community really is your children. And if you're like, well, I don't want them there because they speak bad language, there's all this attitude, or, they got issues and I don't want to bring it here because the kids have to be, like, we have these really deficit and negative language about our communities and families, then that's the problem. Because those communities are children. Those adults were children, probably in your classroom or in your program. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that.
This is fantastic. I wish we had 7 more hours to dive in together. I'm really seeing some parallel process in what you're talking about communities, parents, families, right? And you're mentioning relationships. When we come to class, we're also talking about real world examples, right? And concept development. If you don't know the world in which your students are coming from, how can you provide real world examples, right? And so that starts with a question. And I think you've really highlighted that. And then my all-time favorite dimension is regard for student perspective. And I think that is like the heart of equity personally, and we could have a whole webinar on that. But what you were talking about is showing regard to your students. If you don't know who they are, what communities they come from, and talking to your parents, and how can you be responsive to their needs when it comes to trauma, when it comes to anti-racist work, when it comes to just every single day needs for our students. That is so important. So thank you for all of the wisdom you've shared with us. I think there's a lot more we could talk about. There's some fantastic questions people are asking, and I hope you all continue to ask those questions and engage with us. Before we pass it back to Winston to close out with some logistics, Yoma, where can folks find out more? Where can they follow you on any social media or your book or your work specifically, and then other recommendations you might have for folks to continue working on this conversation beyond this webinar?
Sure. Well, thank you for again, I want to thank, Winston, Tatiana, T-Stone, all of you guys. I know I've gotten better with Twitter. Thank goodness. I know I'm like Twitter. I just blast everything. So I can be found at Twitter at Iheoma Iruka, Iheomairuka. And then I have a book that came out in April, which I want to thank really the early child community for making it really what has been shared widely in book readings and all of that, called Don't Look Away. So if you Google my name, I think I'm the only Iheoma Iruka in the whole daggone world. So if you actually Google my name, you actually will find me, and obviously engage in a lot of different webcasts and Facebook sort of groups. And again, it's a journey that all of us are on, and to reach out and to not try to be perfect, but to just be open and really to focus on being anti-racist and creating anti-racist environments, right? Early childhood is such an important time in everybody's lives. And it's a time for children. So let's think about our children, but also think about yourself, right? We all have to be taking care of ourselves. So please make sure that you do that. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, I wish we had another hour for this discussion. I feel like, if you probably were busy talking, but if you could see the feedback we were getting from the chat, I mean, I think that there was such a need for this conversation, and people so appreciate your expertise, the real world examples that you shared. I mean, my head's just been spinning because I was just like blown away by this phenomenal conversation, and just truly appreciate you being here. For those asking in the chat, I just shared the link to Iheoma's book. I shared her Twitter handle, so you can follow her on Twitter. I encourage you to do that. And she's getting better at it, so that's great. so funny. And I unfortunately, I think we're going to, and I don't know if we have a couple of minutes. I'm going to just say, like, well, let's answer one or two more questions, Iheoma, if that's okay. I'm going to try and get my stuff. I'll spend just 2 minutes at the end. But let's see. And Tatiana, if you had any other specific questions, I've got a few from the audience here. I think you've already defined some of the terms. That was a question earlier on. Let's see, what's a good one here? How do you see building resilience as more of a focus in and after the pandemic? That was one that was kind of asked in a couple of different ways.
Oh, that's a good question. So resilience is such a positive word, and I hate to sort of burn it down, but resilience basically is saying, how could you do well because you're experiencing such either tragedy, either trauma? And yes, we can build resilience because of relationships, because of nurturing environments, all those good things. But kids should not have to build resilience if the system worked, right? To say, hey, Black and brown children and Asian children, oh my goodness, I'm so glad you're resilient. No, I don't want to be resilient. I want you to create a system that is also works for me and not just white people. So I sort of say, yes, let's keep talking about resilience, but no, I need you to do better so that my kids don't have to go work at being the best students and also go be resilient at the same time, because that means that their cognitive capacities are being tasked all the time, and where other kids don't have to have those cognitive dissonance and those cognitive loads. So yes, we can. So I think it's whatever relationship we can all create, whether affirmative environments we can all create, but adults, I need us to do a much better job. I don't need to go create resilience in my, they're forced into it. We need to just do better as adults and create a system and be part of a system that's not privileging only one group, and that really is providing the best opportunity for all children, really. Sorry to throw out resilience. It's important, but really there's a reason why we should not promote that all the time.
That's awesome. That's great. Okay, so one other question, and this might be too much to ask it in just a few minutes left, but one question came in earlier. How do we discuss racism in an area where it's primarily white and they don't believe there's racism anymore, or they don't realize they have biases?
Oh, that's, you know what, to me, that's exactly like that's who I want to talk to. I'm like, look, all you Black and brown people, y'all, we've been talking about this forever, but that's exactly where it should be talked about. The only way that racism is a system of oppression and white supremacy. The only way I believe it can really fully be is only by talking. Not only, but it's primarily going to be through talking to white people, and specifically talking about it with young white children, right? Because by the time you are probably about 4 or 5, a lot of what the foundation of what you're thinking and know is already set. And so to me, part of how to talk about it is to really visit it upon, well, the history. right? Like you have to understand this idea of meritocracy, of opportunity, you know, like you have to really say, hey, part of why you are here and able to be in an all-white cast and be fabulous and fantastic is because of white privilege and the racist system that made sure that people of color, immigrants, et cetera, would not provide the same opportunity. It actually has to happen a lot more in white majority, white only settings, because by not doing that, all it does is basically create this safety and this idea that I am here and I am thriving and doing great. And I am the standard that we should all bear. Is something that we have to literally work on. Being white and whiteness should not be the standard that all other people are being judged, especially when the system was completely not created for you and about you.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I think we're gonna have to stop here. So we've only got a few more minutes left. And actually one question that I can answer, what are some other classes or trainings to talk about this? So I'm happy to share that IOMA participated in our development of a trauma-informed care course that we're launching in early August. We are super excited about this training because it addresses this topic and several others that I think are really timely. And so I'll go back to sharing my screen here. We'll go through just a couple more slides to wrap things up. But that trauma course is called Interactions at the Heart of Healing. And IOMA is featured there along with several others. And before I get into that, I just want to give a quick plug for a couple of other webinars that we have coming up. We are running a series of these with all sorts of experts from around the field of trauma or trauma-related topics. Next week, we're going to be talking to Amanda Williford about relationship equity in your classroom. And then July 29th, promoting resilience and hopes in times of trauma. So that'll be interesting to see kind of what she talks about it as it relates to resilience, because I love IOMA's answer on that too. But that'll be on July 29th with Rachel Wagner. So I'd encourage you to sign up for those. And I will send in the chat panel here a link to where you can learn more about those webinars. We also had a few webinars over the past couple of weeks that I would encourage you to check out. We've had just some phenomenal content. You know, I think that having guests like IOMA who are really super knowledgeable in these areas has allowed us just to share their expertise to thousands of people at a time. And we're just so appreciative of folks taking the time to join us on these discussions. So next, I did mention there's a trauma-informed course that we have created, which is phenomenal. And Tatiana's been involved in that. IOMA was one of the subject matter experts in the course around how to be an anti-bias trauma-informed educator. We also talk about seeing behaviors, communication, building relationship equity, lots of other stuff. This is an online course for teachers, but really for any educators. So I'll send the link to that in the chat. One other thing that I wanted to promote here at the end, we are super excited that in early August, the 4th and 5th of August, we are going to have our first teacher-focused conference where IOMA will be speaking and one of our keynotes. And so if you want to hear more from IOMA, come join us at the Teacher Summit. We've had a tremendous response to this event. We actually had a virtual event in the spring that was open, really targeted to any educators. And we had a great response. We had tons of teachers show up. And so we thought, you know, coming back into this weird situation in the fall of 2020, what better way than to have another virtual event and invite as many teachers as we can. And so I'll include information in the chat there about our Interact Now Teacher Summit. We hope you can join us in early August. And lastly, we have a course on the website, the Class Foundations for Teachers course. So IOMA mentioned some class concepts in her discussion. Several of you noted at the beginning that you are not as familiar with class. And so I would encourage you to check out the Class Foundations for Teachers. It's an online course. We just launched it this spring, and I think it's a great solution for folks who are coming back to the classrooms in the fall or who are new to class. I'm trying to grab the link to that, but there's a link on our website, I promise, and I'll find that link and share it. Here we go. So I'll share that in the chat panel. So with that, we're going to wrap things up. We are at 1:59. So we actually managed to finish on time. I think we could have gone another 2 hours. Just to reiterate, I will send out an email within the next 24 hours with the recording, the slides, resources that Ioma mentioned. I've shared out the link to Ioma's book, but we'll include that as well in ways that you can engage with Ioma going forward. We hope you'll join us for the Interact Teacher Summit. Check out our trauma-informed care course. We've just got some really exciting stuff happening at Teachstone. We're so glad that you could come join us today. Thank you so much for all the comments and feedback. Thank you so much to Ioma Iruka for being here with us and sharing so much of her wonderful knowledge. It's been like an amazing, enlightening experience. Hopefully some of those folks who started at a 1 or a 2 on the happiness scale have maybe progressed a little bit further now, notched up a bit. I think this was refreshing for everybody. And I know I came away with some new perspectives. And Tatiana, thank you so much for joining and facilitating the discussion. This was wonderful. With that, it's 2 o'clock. We're going to sign off. Thank you so much again. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. We'll talk to you soon.